20 years ago, there was a club of relatively young and rambunctious writers in New York who met regularly, calling themselves the Vile Body. A smaller subset of that group would have occasional dinners at a Chinese restaurant on 2nd Avenue near the UN called Flower Drum to read from their works in progress. Terry Teachout, Maggie Gallagher, the founding editor of City Journal, Richard Vigilante, and our next speaker were among that number. Dr. Tim Flanagan is a member of the school's Board of Regents, a graduate of Dartmouth and Cornell University Medical College, and is currently Dean's Professor of Medical Science at Brown and Director of Infectious Disease at the Miriam and Rhode Island Hospitals. Dr. Flanagan is a member of the Board of Directors of the Haitian Project and was recently ordained a deacon in the Diocese of Providence. Tim?
Thank you so much, Jamie. It's wonderful to be here and a great honor to introduce Roger Kimball. So Roger is the publisher of the New Criterion, which was founded in the wake of T.S. Eliot's Criterion magazine, which was the pinnacle of literary critique in England quite some time ago. He is no stranger to controversy. He is the author of, quote, Tenured Radicals, How Politics Has Corrupted Higher Education. And his most recent book, published just in 2012, is The Fortunes of Permanence, Culture and Anarchy in the Age of Amnesia. As Jamie mentioned, he and a few others used to gather at various different pubs in New York to read each other's work, reminiscent of the Inklings. I personally came to know Roger not because I was invited to any of those pubs, to my dismay, but because I've had the great pleasure to race with him on our boat, the Flanagan boat, the Estrella, against the Petito. And as some of you know, the Petito was William F. Buckley's boat, and Roger and a number of his friends had the good fortune to acquire. And I asked him if he would pay me enough in the beginning, and he did not. So I'll let you know that the Estrella came out very well in those races. But he was a real pleasure, not just sharing his thoughts, but also sharing his sailing adventures and good food and good wine. He's a lover of both of those. So Roger, to you.
Thank you, Tim. I was asked before I came here whether I wanted any audio-visual equipment. I said no, but after hearing Tim's description of the race, I feel as though I should project the picture I carry around on my iPhone of the time we did win. I can show it to any of you who are interested afterwards. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here. I spoke here a few years ago at another one of these conferences, and it really is an honor as well as a pleasure. I think the topic that I was assigned, is there such a thing as Catholic art, is maybe paradoxical, unusual. You might think it's one of those self-answering rhetorical questions like, is the Pope Catholic? Of course there is such a thing as Catholic art, as anyone who can pronounce the phrase Sistine Chapel or the name Flannery O'Connor knows. Clearly, at any rate, there's art that's made by Catholics, just as there is art that dilates on Christian or Catholic themes. But that's not what I mean in asking whether there is such a thing as Catholic art. Sometimes I think the very simplest questions are the hardest to answer, and this may be one of them. Take the question, why do we care about art? That we care about it seems pretty clear. It's graven in the stones of our museums, theaters, and concert halls, embossed on the pages of novels and volumes of poetry, enshrined in the deference, financial, social, spiritual deference, that the institutions of art command in our society. But why? Why this deference? Art satisfies no practical need. It's not useful in the sense in which a law court or a hospital farm or a machinist's shop is useful. And yet, we invest art and the institutions that represent it with enormous privilege and prestige. Why? Why is something apparently useless accorded such honor? Now, one reason, of course, is that utility is not our only criterion of value. We care about many things that are not, in any normal sense, useful. Indeed, for many of the things that we care about most, the question of use seems out of place somehow, a kind of existential category of state. But still, we can ask, what is it about art, about aesthetic experience, that recommends itself so powerfully to our regard? A lot of ink has been spilled trying to answer that question. The word aesthetics was not coined, and the discipline it names was not born until the middle of the 18th century. But a fascination with beauty is perennial. Beauty, wrote the philosopher Jacques Maritain, would, quote, like us to believe that paradise is not lost. It has the savor of the terrestrial paradise because it restores, for a moment, that peace and the simultaneous delight of the intellect and the senses. From Plato down, philosophers and artists, and philosopher-artists like Plato, have eulogized beauty as providing intimations of spiritual wholeness and lost unity. This is one reason that of all the branches of philosophy, aesthetics tends to be the most oleaginous. Especially in times when traditional religious commitments are in retreat, and I think we're living in such a time, many people look to art for spiritual dividends previously sought elsewhere. This burdens art, I think, and intellectual talk about art with intoxicating expectations. The expectations are consistently disappointed, but the intoxication remains. The result is the hothouse rhetoric of Romanticism, full of infinite longings, sublime impatience, impetuous raids on an ever-retreating capital A absolute. One problem with this tendency to invest art with unanchored religious sentiment is that it makes it very difficult to keep art's native satisfactions in focus. The difficulty is compounded because aesthetic delight involves a feeling of wholeness that is easy to mistake for religious exaltation. Art does offer balm for the spirit, but it is not a religious balm. Exactly what sort of balm is it? Therein lies this tale. Now, everyone cares, or at least says he cares, about art. After all, art ennobles the spirit, elevates the mind, educates the emotions. Or does it? In fact, there is a tremendous irony that attends our culture's continuing investment in art, emotional, financial, and social investment, given the oppositional and transgressive character of so much of the contemporary art world. We continue to behave as if art were something special, something important, something spiritually refreshing. But when we canvass the roster of name artists today, what do we find? Well, doubtless we find a great many things. But it is striking how much of what we find exists in the febrile bubble of, quote, cutting-edge notoriety. It's a curious situation. Traditionally, the goal or end of fine art was to make beautiful objects. Beauty itself came with a lot of Platonic and Christian metaphysical baggage, some of it indifferent or even, note well, positively hostile to art. A lot of what the talk about beauty was hostile to art. But art without beauty was, if not exactly a contradiction in terms, at least an example of failed art. Now, how different things are today. Nevertheless, if large precincts of the art world have jettisoned the traditional link between art and beauty, they have done nothing to disown the social prerogatives of art. Indeed, we suffer today from a peculiar form of moral anesthesia, an anesthesia based on the delusion that by calling something art, we thereby purchase for it a blanket exemption from moral criticism, as if being art automatically rendered all moral considerations beside the point. A juror in the obscenity trial over Robert Mapplethorpe's notorious photographs of the S&M homosexual underworld memorably epitomized this paralysis. Acknowledging that he did not like Mapplethorpe's rebarbative photographs, the juror nonetheless concluded that, quote, if people say it's art, I have to go along with it, period, end quote. Now, I think it's worth pausing to digest that comment. If people say it's art, then I have to go along with it. It's also worth confronting that juror's conclusion with a question. Why do so many people feel that if something is regarded as art, they have to go along with it, no matter how offensive it might be? Part of the answer has to do with the confusion of art and free speech. Another part of the answer has to do with the evolution of what we might call the institutionalization of the avant-garde and its postures of defiance. You all know the drill. The black tie dinners at a major museum, tout le monde in attendance, celebrating the latest art world freak. Maybe it's the Chapman brothers with their pubescent female mannequins festooned with erect penises. Maybe it's Mike Kelly with his mutilated dolls, or Jeff Koons with his pornographic sculptures depicting him and his former wife having sex, or Cindy Sherman with her narcissistic feminism, or Jenny Holzer with her political slogans. The list is endless. As with any collusion of snobbery and artistic nullity, such spectacles have their amusing aspects, as Tom Wolfe, for example, has brilliantly shown in some of his writings about the art world. His latest novel has some particularly choice scenes about the Basel Art Fair. In the end, though, the aftermath of the avant-garde has been the opposite of amusing. It's been very depressing indeed. It's been a kind of cultural disaster. For one thing, by universalizing the spirit of opposition, it has threatened to transform the practice of art into a purely negative enterprise. In large precincts of the art world today, art is oppositional or it is nothing. Celebrity replaces aesthetic achievement as the goal of art. It is a situation that tempts one to sympathize with Leo Tolstoy's views on art. In the famous passage of What is Art, his book on this subject, Tolstoy wrote that art in our society has been so perverted that not only has bad art come to be considered good art, but even the very perception of what art really is has been lost. Poor Tolstoy. He thought things were bad in the 1890s. What if he were around today? Imagine him strolling through the Chelsea galleries in New York, or taking in the latest offerings at Tate Modern, Matthew Barney, Damien Hirst, the Chapman brothers, Tracy Emin. What a menagerie. Tolstoy would not, I suspect, have thought much of Andy Warhol as an artist, but he would have admired his candor. Art, Warhol observed in 1987, is what you can get away with. Too true, Andy. Too true. Consider, just take just one example, the case of Damien Hirst, who is, in the prevailing scale of awfulness, I think clocks in at about 50%. Not nearly as disgusting as some, but still reliably repellent and wildly successful. So he's a good example. A few years ago, the BBC reported on a terrible mishap at the Eye Storm Gallery in London. I quote, "A cleaner at a London gallery cleared away an institution by artist Damien Hirst, having mistaken it for rubbish. Emmanuel Lasare came across a pile of beer bottles, coffee cups, and overflowing ashtrays and cleared them away." I remember thinking at the time that Mr. Lasare's bold act of art criticism qualified him for a senior post at a major London newspaper. As far as I know, however, no paper took the initiative. More's a pity. Meanwhile, Mr. Lasare's good work was undone, since the gallery owners, spurred possibly by the six-figure sum that Hirst's work was expected to fetch, instantly set about putting his opus back together. Thank goodness they had records of how it looked. Now, there are two things to bear in mind about Damien Hirst. The first is that his work is not a freakish exception in the contemporary art world, but is, on the contrary, wholly typical of what is adulated as important art today. The second point is that this sort of thing, far from being novel, has been around for at least a century. In 1914, Marcel Duchamp, the inventor of Dadaism, dusted off a commercial bottle rack and offered it, tongue planted firmly in cheek, to the public as a work of art. The public, at least the taste-making part of it, swooned with delighted outrage. In 1917, Duchamp upped the ante. He scrawled the name R. Mutt on a urinal, baptized it Fountain, and said, in effect, "How about it?" What a delicious scandal ensued. How original, how innovative, but also how destructive of the essential protocols and metabolism of art. But not, it soon became clear, as destructive as Duchamp had wished. "I threw the bottle rack and the urinal into their faces as a challenge," Duchamp noted contemptuously years later, "and now they admire them for their aesthetic beauty." Duchamp had wished not to extend, but to short circuit, to destroy the whole category of art and aesthetic delectation. Instead, his antics polluted and trivialized it. These days, a great premium is placed on novelty in the art world. If something can't be labeled as new, it is out of the running in the celebrity sweepstakes of contemporary art. But here's the irony. Almost everything championed as innovative in contemporary art is essentially a tired repetition of gestures inaugurated by Duchamp and his immediate successors. Damien Hirst, we've been there. Tracy Emin and her unmade bed, we've done that. Jeff Koons, Barbara Kruger, ditto, ditto, ditto. As the sage of Ecclesiastes put it, there's nothing new under the sun. Of course, not all the news from the art world, which is not quite the same thing as the world of art, is bad. There's plenty of vigorous, appealing, accomplished art being produced today. It just tends not to be the art you see paraded about at the Chelsea galleries or the Whitney Museum of American Art. It is not the sort of thing you see celebrated in the pages of the New York Times or featured in the trendier precincts of the art world. The serious art of today tends to be a quiet affair. It takes place not at Tate Modern or the Museum of Modern Art, not in the Chelsea or Bushwick galleries, but off to one side, out of the limelight. But this would have done nothing to cheer Tolstoy. Indeed, even though it is easy to concur with his judgment that art in our society has been perverted, his own view of what art really is must give us pause. Tolstoy was very strict indeed about the feelings he thought it proper for art to convey. In his view, the upper classes of his own society, as a result of unbelief, favored art that was, and I'm quoting now, reduced to the conveying of the feelings of vanity, the tedium of living, and above all, sexual lust, end quote. For Tolstoy, art should be a spiritual organ of human life. Now that sounds plenty reassuring, but his conception of what counts as legitimately spiritual is so narrow that it excludes not only the Damien Hirsts of the world, but also most of the world's great artists. Of the literature of his own time, for example, he seems to have approved of some simple folk tales and fables about peasants, but little else. Anything that traded in mystery or symbolism, he abominated. Baudelaire, crude egotism erected into a theory. He didn't pass muster. Nor did Verlaine, flabby licentiousness. Mallarmé, devoid of meaning. Now, this is not the place for me to give you a full inventory of the odd opinions expressed in what is art. The contention, for example, that in the future, artists will be so devoted to their work that they will, quote, not even understand how it is possible for an artist whose joy consists in the widest dissemination of his works to give these works only in exchange for a certain payment. In other words, artists will work for free in the future. That hasn't come about yet. But it is worth noting the breathtaking extent of Tolstoy's bill of indictment. Beethoven's Opus 101 is, quote, only an unsuccessful attempt at art, while the Ninth Symphony, said Tolstoy, is without any doubt belongs to the category of bad art. Dante fails to make the grade, and so does Kipling. Tolstoy tells us about how he sat through a production of Hamlet and shudders at the recollection of, quote, that special suffering produced by false simulacra of artistic works. The bottom line is that for Tolstoy, art is either a handmaiden of a certain species of moral pedagogy or it's corrupt. So the problem, or at least one problem with Tolstoy's Amenad version, is that he threatens to throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. And yet it is worth reminding ourselves that Tolstoy's wary attitude about art is far from exceptional. We tend to place a metaphysical plus sign in front of art, linking it with religion as a beneficent expression of human creativity. But the traditional attitude toward art and beauty has been characterized as much by suspicion as by celebration. There has been a recurrent worry that the attractions of beauty will lead us to forsake the good for the sake of a good. The eyes delight in beautiful shapes of different sorts and bright and attractive colors, wrote Augustine in a typical passage, warning against the temptations of visual pleasure. I would not have these things take possession of my soul. Let God possess it. He who made them all, he made them all very good, but it is he who is my good, not they. There is a similar uneasiness with art. The Platonic Christian tradition investing beauty with ontological significance looks to beauty for a revelation of the unity and proportion of what really is. In this sense, our apprehension of beauty betokens a recognition of and a submission to a reality that transcends us. But the alliance between art and illusion also mobilizes beauty, enlisting it and its charming fabrications in a project that may delude us. As Jacques Maritain, to quote him again, put it, art establishes a world apart, closed, limited, absolute, an autonomous world that at least for a moment relieves man of the ennui of living and willing. And while this is certainly true, certainly not true of all art, it is easy to see Maritain's point. Instead of directing our attention beyond sensible beauty toward its super-sensible source, art works to fascinate us with beauty's apparently self-sufficient presence, even drawing, if necessary, on the prestige of its association with the super-sensible to strengthen its effect. It counterfeits being in lieu of revealing. Considered thus as an end in itself, apart from God or being, beauty appears first of all as a usurper, furnishing not a foretaste of beatitude, but a humanly contrived substitute. From this point of view, as the philosopher Iris Murdoch explains in her book about Plato, art is dangerous chiefly because it apes the spiritual and subtly disguises and trivializes it. This helps explain why Western thinking about art and beauty has tended to oscillate between adulation on the one hand and deep suspicion on the other. It marks a tension that finds dramatic expression in Mitya Karamazov's lament that beauty is the battlefield where God and the devil war for the soul of man. Now, this tension, I think, goes deep. When deploring the terrible state of the art world today, and Tolstoy's word perverted is not too strong, I think, we often look back to the Renaissance as a golden age when art and religion were in harmony and all was right in the world. But for many traditional thinkers, the Renaissance was the start of all the trouble. Thus Maritain again, claiming that with the 16th century, the lie installed itself into painting. He charges that the Renaissance was to drive the artist mad and to make of him the most miserable of men by revealing to him his own peculiar grandeur and by letting loose on him the wild beast beauty, which faith had kept enchanted and led after it docile. Now, if Maritain is right, already with the shattering of the medieval cosmos and the flowering of Renaissance humanism, I'm quoting now, prodigal art aspired to become the ultimate end of man, his bread and wine, the consubstantial mirror of beatific beauty. How seriously should we take this rhetoric that fuses and confuses the ambitions of art and religion? No doubt it is in part hyperbole, but I think like most hyperbole, talk of the artist as a second god and so on is exorbitant language striving to express an exorbitant claim. Here the claim originates in man's burgeoning consciousness of himself as a free and creative being. As the philosopher Hans of Blumenberg observed, the discovery of the capacity for creativity is part of the self-articulation of modern consciousness, however much it may have been connected with the formulas used initially, as Blumenberg points out, with a pious intent, of the alter deus, and the deus in terris, the second god, the earthly god, which had served at first as hyperbolical paraphrases of the biblical idea that God made man in his own image. Now we have to wait for Romanticism and the flowering of the cult of genius for the completion of that discovery made in the Renaissance. But the apotheosis of artistic creativity begins long before the 19th century, already with the rise of fixed-point perspective, which Alberti's On Painting, published in 1435, first systematized and made generally available. The artist enters into a new consciousness of his freedom and creativity. Space is geometrized, reconstructed according to a matrix provided by the subject, by the artist. As Erwin Panofsky pointed out, the achievement of fixed-point perspective marked not only the elevation of art into a science, the prospect of which so enthused Renaissance artists, who were scientists as well as artists, many of them, but also became a kind of objectification of the subjective, a subjection of the visible world to the rule of mathematics, a man-made science. And Panofsky points out that this strange fascination which perspective had for the Renaissance mind cannot be accounted for exclusively by a craving for verisimilitude. It wasn't just the fact that fixed point perspective allowed them to make drawings and paintings that looked a lot more realistic than had hitherto been possible. There was something else, Panofsky points out. There was a curious inward correspondence between perspective and what may be called the general mental attitude of the Renaissance. The process of projecting an object on a plane in such a way that the resulting image is determined by the distance and location of a point of view, symbolized, as it were, the Weltanschauung of a period which had inserted an historical distance quite comparable to the perspectival one between itself and the classical past, and had assigned to the mind of man a place in the center of the universe, just as perspective assigned to the eye a place in the center of its graphic representation. Now, in this sense, the perfection of one-point perspective betokens not only the mastery of a particular artistic technique, it also implies a new attitude toward the world. Increasingly, nature is transformed from a book in which man's destiny is figuratively writ into material for the artists and the technicians play, the artists and the scientists play. The closer one moves to the present time, the more blatant and unabashed the association of the artist with God becomes. Thus, Alexander Baumgarten, writing in the mid-1700s, compares the poet to God, in the mid-1700s, compares the poet to a god and likens his creation to a world. Hence, says Baumgarten, by analogy with whatever is evident to the philosopher regarding the real world, the same can be thought of a poem. And the Earl of Shaftesbury, whose enormous influence on 18th century aesthetics does not seem to be widely appreciated today, asserts that in the employment of his imagination, the artist becomes, quote, a second god, a just Prometheus. Now, it's curious, Prometheus is a curiously ambiguous figure in mythology, and to speak of a just Prometheus seems provocative, to say the least. But the facts, if not the implications of the statement, are recognized by many later philosophers. For instance, Ernst Cassirer, in his gloss on Shaftesbury's Paean, says the following: "The difference between man and God disappears," he writes, "when we consider man not simply with respect to his original, immanent forming powers, not as something created, but as a creator in his own right. Here man's real Promethean nature comes to light." Man's real Promethean nature. If the artist in the modern age emerges as a kind of second god, his lordship, based on an assertion of human autonomy, tends to shut itself off from reality in order to clear a space for art's ensorceling fabrications. As such, the artist tends to draw close to the demonic, which Kierkegaard astutely defines as freedom shutting itself up, apart from the good. One thinks, for example, of Milton's Satan, who in Paradise Lost says, "Myself and hell," a moment of startling self-insight. If, as Valery put it, the artist's whole business is to make something out of nothing, then unable to meet this demand, the artist will find himself wandering alone among the shadows cast by a world he forsook in order to salvage his freedom in creativity. Divination gives way to demonization. The impulse behind this development has its roots in the demand for freedom in a world where freedom is increasingly eclipsed. Now, the notion that beauty has the savor of the terrestrial paradise, in Maritain's phrase, is one way of expressing beauty's power to deliver us from the strictures of time and empirical reality. As such, it implies an analogy between beauty and beatitude. And now an analogy, of course, operates by positing an element of similarity between things that, in other respects, are dissimilar. And in order to grasp the analogy as an analogy, we must do justice to both what joins and to what distinguishes the terms of the analogy. The element of difference is thus no less essential in preserving the analogy than the element of similarity in establishing it. Understood as a foretaste of beatitude, beauty maintains its status as analog by affirming its place in an integrated ontological order. As the radiance of beauty, to use that's the last phrase, the radiance of beauty, beauty subordinates itself to what it reveals. The genitive here, I think, expresses something like a hierarchy, a rank order. But emancipated from that order, beauty threatens to displace the totality it once illuminated, conjuring in its stead a rival order of its own. As the difference that analogy depends on resolves, the prime analogate becomes phantom-like, inaccessible. Words like paradise, being, beatitude, God. To what extent does our culture, never mind our own theological commitments, to what extent does our culture at large still in good faith entertain such terms more than rootless similitudes? And if the place they have traditionally occupied becomes empty, is it surprising that aesthetic experience, with its power to arrest and enrapture, should step in to fill the vacancy? We don't need Nietzsche to tell us that the disintegration of the Platonic Christian worldview, begun already in the late Middle Ages with nominalistic and voluntaristic speculations on the infinity and omnipotence of the Christian God, is today a cultural given. Nor is it news that the shape of modernity, a shape that emerged in large part out of man's faith in the power of human reason and technology to remake the world in its own image, has made it increasingly difficult to hold on to the analogy between beauty and beatitude in any but a disconcertingly analogous way. Again, the traditional view ties beauty to being and truth, investing it with ontological significance. But modernity, the beneficiary of Descartes' relocation of truth to the subject, cogito ergo sum, implies the autonomy of the aesthetic sphere, and hence the isolation of beauty from being or truth. For to the extent that human reason is made the measure of reality, beauty forfeits its ontological claim and becomes merely aesthetic, that is to say, merely a matter of feeling. Now, I've gone through this little sketch of some of the history of thinking about beauty and art and its relationship to being, because I believe that there's an important difference between asking whether great art can be created absent a belief in the transcendent power of truth, beauty, and goodness, and asking, on the contrary, about the chances of a renewed religious seriousness within the fine arts. At the end of his book, Human Accomplishment, the social scientist Charles Murray argues that religion is indispensable in igniting great accomplishment in the arts. Religion is indispensable, he says, to igniting great accomplishment in the arts. He goes on to note that he's using the term religion at once loosely and also stringently. Going to church every Sunday is not the definition I have in mind, says Murray, nor even a theology in its traditional sense. Confucianism and classical Greek thought were both essentially secular and looked at the cultures they produced. But both schools of thought were tantamount to religion in that they articulated a human place in the cosmos, laid out a clear understanding of the end, the good, toward which humans aim, and exalted standards of human behavior. And that brings me, says Murray, to the sense in which I use religion stringently. Confucianism and Aristotelianism, and with the great religions of the world, are for grown-ups, requiring mature contemplation of truth, beauty, and the good. Cultures in which the creative elites are not engaged in that kind of mature contemplation don't produce great art. Now, I have a great deal of sympathy with the intention behind Charles Murray's argument, but my first response to his contention that religion is indispensable in igniting great accomplishments in the arts might be summed up by that Saul Steinberg cartoon that was a cover of the New York Times Magazine years ago, in which a small yes is jetting along toward a large but. Yes, but. Murray has done a lot to insulate his argument, I think. By religion, he doesn't mean church-going or even theology. He is right that classical Greece, though essentially secular, I might say pagan, but that secular is close enough, was a cultural powerhouse. It was religious insofar as it devoted serious attention, in Murray's phrase, to contemplating truth, beauty, and the good. But I wonder, in one sense, Murray seems to be arguing that in order to have serious art, you have to take art seriously, hence the bit about truth, beauty, and the good. Listing toward tautology, perhaps, but fair enough. The question is whether a culture in which elites engage in mature contemplation of truth, beauty, and the good is necessarily religious in any but an honorific sense. Like Cardinal Newman, I believe that about a great many things, to think correctly is to think like Aristotle. And Aristotle certainly devoted serious attention to truth, beauty, and the good. But was he or the culture which he advocated religious? I don't think so. not in any serious sense, I think. Noting that our own culture is aggressively secular, the names Darwin, Marx, Freud, and Einstein stand as beacons in humanity's progressive self-disillusionment, Murray suggests that disillusionment itself may be ephemeral, merely a stage in mankind's spiritual maturation. The period from the Enlightenment through the 20th century, he suggests, may well eventually be seen as a kind of adolescence of our species. Who can say? Kant thought that maturity came with the Enlightenment. Enlightenment betokened man's coming of age, his leaving his self-caused immaturity, whereby immaturity Kant meant the incapacity to use one's intelligence without guidance by another. The primary lack that forestalled the Enlightenment was therefore not intellectual, but moral. It was, Kant thought, the lack of courage to face up to the way the world really is. Now, there's plenty to criticize about the Enlightenment, just as, let us remind ourselves, there's plenty to celebrate about it. But my point is merely to question whether the symbiotic relationship between great art and religion is as close as Murray and many others have suggested. Fra Angelico, a deeply religious painter, was a great artist. But then, so was Titian, a conspicuously worldly one. Bach was a pious soul and was possibly the greatest composer who ever lived. But what about Beethoven? If he was religious, it was in a very different sense from the way Bach was. Jane Austen was conventionally religious in her personal life, but her novels, although great, maybe the greatest, are specimens of secular wit and wisdom. Art and religion are both eulogistic words. Calling something a work of art endows it with a nimbus of value. The same is true of religious. But is it the same value? The Catholic Welsh poet David Jones had it right, I think, when he suggested that no integrated, widespread religious art, properly so called, can be looked for outside the enormous changes in the character and orientation and nature of our civilization. Changes, I think, that would be deeply at odds with our commitment to liberal democracy. Jones agrees that it would be nice if the best of man's creative powers were at the direct service of the sanctuary. But that can only happen if the epoch itself is characterized by those qualities. This cannot, he argues, be said of our epoch. It is not, he goes on to note, a matter of will. What is possible to the artist in the way of creating religious art has little or nothing to do with the will or wishes of this or that artist. Be a painter ever so pious, still he cannot, by taking through the change in himself into an artistic sense of some other cultural consequence. In other words, to paraphrase him, some things were possible in the Middle Ages which are just not realistically possible today. I think Jones is right about that. The real threat to the arts, he thought, was the modern world's increasing submission to technocracy, to a thoroughly instrumental view of life that had no room for what Jones called the intransitive, for that realm of freedom and disinterestedness that were traditionally the province of religious experience. On the one hand, an art and aesthetic experience on the other hand. This disjunction is crucial. The priest and the artist, he says, might both be consigned to catacombs, but they are separate catacombs. Art aims at the perfection of a work, religion aims at the perfection of the soul. At bottom, Jones argued, there can no more be Catholic art than there can be a Catholic science of hydraulics, a Catholic vascular system, or a Catholic equilateral triangle. W.H. Auden made a similar point when he wrote that there can no more be Christian art than there can be Christian science or a Christian diet. There can only be a Christian spirit in which an artist or a scientist works or does not work. Now, I'm coming to the end here soon. We live at a time when art is enlisted in all manner of extra artistic projects, from gender politics to the grim linguistic leftism of neo-Marxists, post-structuralists, gender theorists, and all the other exotic fauna. who are congregating in and about the art world and the academy. The subjugation of art and of cultural life generally to political ends has been one of the great spiritual tragedies of our age. Among much else, it has made it increasingly difficult to appreciate art on its own terms, as something affording its own kinds of insights and satisfactions. This situation has made it imperative for critics who care about art to champion the distinctively aesthetic qualities against attempts to reduce art to a species of propaganda. At the same time, we lose something important when our conception of art does not have room for a spiritual dimension. I think that's true. If this is what Charles Murray meant when he suggested that, quote, religion, or at least serious attention to the ends of human life, is indispensable in igniting great accomplishments in the arts, I would agree. That is to say, politicizing the aesthetic poses a serious threat to the integrity of art. The isolation of the aesthetic from other dimensions of life represents a different sort of threat. The principle of art for art's sake, T.S. Eliot observed, is still valid insofar as it can be taken as an exhortation to the artist to stick to his job. It never was and never can be valid for the spectator, the reader, or the auditor. The Austrian art critic Hans Zettelmeyer articulated this point of view eloquently in the 1950s. The fact is, Zettelmeyer wrote, that art cannot be assessed by a measure that is purely aesthetic and nothing else. Indeed, such a purely artistic measure, which ignored the human element, the element which alone gives art its justification, would actually not be an artistic measure at all. It would merely be an aesthetic one, and actually the application of purely aesthetic standards is one of the peculiarly inhuman features of the modern age, for it proclaims by implication the autonomy of the work of art, an autonomy that has no regard to men, the principle of l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. In the 19th century, art had long been freed from serving the ideological needs of religion, and yet the spiritual crisis of the age tended to invest art with ever greater existential burdens. Burdens that continue in various ways to be felt down into our own age, as witness the poet Wallace Stevens' contention that after one has abandoned a belief in God, poetry is that essence which takes its place as life's redemption. Now, the idea that poetry, that art generally, should serve as a source, perhaps the primary source of spiritual sustenance in the secular age, is a romantic notion that continues to resonate powerfully. It helps to explain, for example, the special aura that attaches to art and artists, even now, even that is to say, at a time when poseurs like Andres Serrano or Bruce Nauman or Gilbert and George and all the other people we've mentioned are accounted artists by persons one might have otherwise expected to be serious people. This romantic inheritance has also figured in various permutations in much avant-garde culture. We have come a long way since Dostoevsky could declare that, incredible though it may seem, the day will come when man will quarrel more fiercely about art than about God. Whether that trek has described a journey of progress is perhaps an open question. My own feeling is that Eliot was right when he disparaged the efforts of moral aesthetes like Matthew Arnold and Walter Pater to find in art a substitute for religion, to preserve, as he put it, the emotions without the beliefs with which their history has been involved. This much, I think, is clear. Without an allegiance to beauty, art degenerates into a kind of caricature of itself. It is beauty that animates aesthetic experience, making it so seductive. But aesthetic experience itself degenerates into a kind of fetish or idol if it is held up as an end in itself, untested by the rest of life. It seems to me that there are as many opportunities for confusion as for enlightenment in linking the ambitions of art and religion. There's much to bemoan about the state of art and culture today. Above all, perhaps, there is a lack of seriousness underwritten by a lack of traditional skill. But in this sense, the emancipation of art from religion is less an impediment than an opportunity. As W.H. Auden again noted in his reflections on Christianity and art, we cannot have any liberty without license to abuse it. The secularization of art enables the really gifted artist to develop his talents to the full. It also permits those with little or no talent to produce vast quantities of phony or vulgar trash. The triumph of the latter does nothing to impeach the promise and achievements of the former. In my Jesuit high school, the priests were wont to dispense various wise sayings, one of which occurred to me when I was pondering this talk. Never deny, seldom affirm, always distinguish. Let's leave to one side the question about whether the direction never denies good advice and settle instead on the admonition always distinguish. Man is the sort of creature whose nature it is to delight in art and aesthetic experience. Man may also be by nature, I believe he is, a religious animal. That is to say, a creature who becomes who he really is only by acknowledging something that transcends him. These different aspects of humanity will often conspire, but we do them both a disservice if we blur or elide their essential difference. I think of Apelles' advice to the cobbler, who began by criticizing the way the great painter delineated a sandal and then went on to criticize other aspects of the painting. Ne sutor capidam sutor judicare, Apelles said, which is Latin, or near enough, or always distinguish. Thanks.
We've got plenty of time for questions this time, so if anybody has one.
Well, since you mentioned her at the outset, Flannery O'Connor was a great admirer of Jacques Maritain. I really am drawn to her stuff, and yet I find it very unbeautiful. But it fulfills three categories for me, which makes it good art. It's not edifying, it doesn't attempt to be didactic, and it's extremely unsentimental. I mean, I've never known anyone I've ever read who's so, and she's been embraced by the entire world, the literary world and the art world, even though she would seem to be vulnerable on a number of fronts, not least of which is because she was so Catholic. So I'd like to get your sense of Flannery O'Connor in the spectrum of literature and art.
Well, I think that Flannery O'Connor was one of the greatest short story writers ever, probably. I think her short stories are probably a little higher on the scale of literary achievement than her novels. But I think it was Robert Thomas Merton who, in writing something about Flannery O'Connor, compared her not to, Faulkner or other writers of the 20th century, but to writers like Sophocles, the best, in other words. I think she saw with a kind of laser-like clarity the imperfection of her subjects, and also, this is what makes her great, I think, is she also appreciated with a burning intensity the activity of grace. And when you think of stories like A Good Man Is Hard to Find, when the misfit shoots the grandmother. And so she would have been all right as long as there was someone there to shoot her every day. It's pretty powerful stuff. Or the story Revelation, where, one of the things that Flannery O'Connor was especially good at was anatomizing snobbery. But it wasn't the snobbery of the kind of bon mot. It was a kind of more pedestrian, domestic sort of snobbery. The lady who's a pig farmer, but she's a little bit higher up the scale than the people who work for her or something. And O'Connor was extremely good at ferreting out those little hubristic moments of the human spirit. But at the same time, I think it's not only the negative side of Flannery O'Connor that makes her great. You sense, it's a drama where equally important is the operation of grace and forgiveness and justice.
interview Richard Ford, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, for a few hours, and touched upon, well, it went all over the place. But Commonweal published part of the interview, and part of it was his religious and spiritual outlook. Now, what I found after rereading this whole opus is that he actually does deal with moral problems, religious problems, race. He doesn't seem to be aware of it. Because when I confronted him and said, well, do you have a Buddhist? He says, well, I'm sort of a Buddhist, which means I don't have any religion. Now, do you find that maybe in your reading of modern authors that they actually are religious without even, in some ways, or dealing with the spiritual problems without acknowledging it, or even, he actually says, what I am doing is making a world without God. Yet God keeps coming in.
Can you repeat the question?
I
can't hear.
Well, I'm sorry.
I can't hear.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, do I think that artists, even if they are explicitly non-religious, are in some sense religious despite themselves? Yeah, that would be fair. Well, I guess I would go back to what I said. I think that man is by nature a creature who delights in both beauty and the aesthetic experience on the one hand, but is also by nature religious. And I think it's part of our DNA, it's part of who we are. That when one way or another we recognize that this world is not enough. Now we might, we might in different ways of denying that, or different ways of trying to come to terms with it. Without a certain kind of education, you might not have the vocabulary to put it in Christian terms or Catholic terms or whatever. But I think that man is a being who's sort of in between, essentially, and he's in between the temporal and something else. So it's not surprising that we find these intimations of immortality or whatever, even in artists who are not explicitly religious. But I guess my point, my major point is that art is one thing and religion is something else. Even though if you were to draw sort of a Venn diagram, there are areas in which there's an overlap and they can conspire toward the same sort of thing. So, but I think it's important, if we're going to do justice to both of them, that we acknowledge that a good work of art has its own canons of achievement, which are different from the canons of religion.
I have to disagree with you. Well, talking with Richard Ford in depth for a few hours, it seemed obvious to me that he was almost art for art's sake in what he did. However, reading it, first time I read some of his books, especially the three Bascom books, of which the middle one, Independence Day, was the most surprised. I was appalled by it. It was just so flat. And then when I reread it, this interview, suddenly I realized that he was grappling with religious and moral questions. And to me, well, maybe it's just my aesthetic, should I put that in quotes, that's what gave it value to me. Obviously, he's a great writer, otherwise he would have won the Pulitzer Prize.
I'm not sure that follows.
You haven't won yet. No, I'm sorry. Well, anyway, that may be just my feeling, or of course my religious point of view. If I didn't see that in there, I'm not sure I would have had enjoyed or got anything out of it.
Peter.
I hope I can be heard.
Yeah.
thank you very much for a talk of enormous breadth, which went across all the arts. But I was very struck by the fact that your examples of the bad state of things were almost all drawn, maybe all drawn from the visual and plastic arts.
Right.
And I've often felt, wondered about why is there an antagonism in that area between art world, as you properly called it, and visual, any religious element in visual and plastic art, which doesn't seem to exist in a number of the other arts, especially music, maybe not poetry. I was just wondering whether there's some other element in the picture that would help clarify.
Well, I think it's because of the place that visual arts occupy in society. That you don't have black tie dinners at the Museum of Modern Art for the latest composer who's just been paid $50 million for his composition. I think that the compact of celebrity, snobbery, and money that fuels the art world, that is to say the world of visual arts, is something that distinguishes its social reality from the other arts. It would be very easy to give examples of fairly repulsive art in other genres. Music, it might be difficult to do. You could give, I think in music, you would mostly be, you'd give examples mostly of the boring. John Cage's 4 and was it 4.33 or something, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which is 4 minutes and 33 seconds of him sitting at a piano and not playing. So, or Babbitt's music, which is, it strives to be mathematically interesting, but musically incredibly boring. In literature, I think that somebody else, William Burroughs' Naked Lunch, pretty, in my view, fairly repellent. Or poetry, much of that Allen Ginsberg wrote is sort of sub-literate, semi-pornographic fatuousness. But it doesn't have, although those are celebrated writers who are, taught with great enthusiasm in the academy, much to the detriment, in my view, of those who are being taught. They don't occupy the same place in the metabolism of our culture that the visual arts do. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I'll take one more if anyone has it, otherwise, okay, John.
A.T. Tolstoy used to talk about Christian philosophy, and he was challenged by philosophers who say, wait a minute, philosophy is philosophy. It can't be a Christian philosophy. And the way that Tolstoy defined Christian philosophy was philosophy in the light of the truth of the revelation. In other words, using philosophical methods, having accepted that truth and proceeding from that truth using philosophy. Could we not envision, at least envision, if it is a practice, a similar Catholic an acceptance of the truth of the revelation and then the employment of the tools of art in the service of that truth?
Yeah, well, as I say, I think there are
plenty. It might not just be religious fiction.
Right. There are plenty of artists who are Christian or Catholic. Some of them deal with Christian themes in their art, some of them don't. But to the question, is there such a thing as Catholic art? So I would say that even if the answer is yes, I think it's like that Saul Steinberg cartoon. Yes, but I would just the point of my talk, I guess, is to caution a certain reticence about being too eager to seize upon art that has a sort of religious theme as a kind of crutch for religion or for art. I think one wants to kind of keep the distinctions clear so that You judge the art by its aesthetic achievements primarily, but keeping in mind, as Zettelmeyer and others said, who I quoted, that ultimately the criterion for art can't be purely aesthetic. It has to have something to do with a larger vision. But at the same time, this confusion of art and religion, which is essentially a romantic one, but has these longer roots, as I tried to briefly sketch, is an unprofitable confusion in the end, I think.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.